The fighter was born to fail. Designed for a war already lost, manufactured in a nation lacking the oil to fuel it, flown by pilots whose best instructors were dead. The P-51 Mustang should never have reached Tokyo. Yet on April 7, 1945, when 108 silver fighters materialized 760 miles from their island base, Japanese pilots stared at an impossibility that would rewrite the rules of modern air warfare. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1942, American aviation engineers at North American Aviation in Inglewood, California, confronted a mathematics problem that seemed insurmountable. The P-51 Mustang, powered by the Allison V-171O engine, possessed exceptional aerodynamics but suffered from anemic high-altitude performance. The aircraft could barely reach 25,000 feet with any combat effectiveness, rendering it nearly useless for bomber escort missions over Europe, where German fighters operated at 30,000 feet and above. The British Royal Air Force, desperate for fighters but disappointed with the Mustang's altitude limitations, relegated early models to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack roles. The aircraft's sleek laminar flow wing, revolutionary cooling system, and lightweight fuselage represented advanced thinking, but without high-altitude performance, these innovations meant nothing. The Mustang seemed destined to become a footnote in aviation history, an also-ran fighter that arrived too late and performed too poorly to matter. Then Rolls-Royce proposed an audacious modification. Replaced the Allison engine with their Merlin, a supercharged V-12 that had powered Spitfires to victory in the Battle of Britain. American engineers initially resisted. The Merlin was a British engine requiring British tooling, British measurements, and British expertise. Converting American production lines to manufacture a foreign power plant would cost months and millions. But the mathematics were undeniable. The Merlin produced 1,700 horsepower at 25,000 feet. Combined with the Mustang's aerodynamic efficiency, the marriage of American airframe and British engine would create something unprecedented, a fighter capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back. A range of over 1,400 miles with drop tanks. By late 1943, P-51B Mustangs equipped with Packard-built Merlin V-1650 engines began arriving in England. The 8th Air Force, which had been hemorrhaging bombers over Germany at unsustainable rates, suddenly possessed a weapon that changed everything. German fighter pilots, accustomed to attacking unescorted bomber formations after the short-range P-47 Thunderbolts turned it back, found themselves facing Mustangs over Berlin itself. The tactical equation reversed. Instead of hunters picking off crippled bombers, Luftwaffe pilots became prey, forced to engage American fighters while low on fuel and outnumbered. By early 1944, the P-51 had achieved air superiority over Western Europe, enabling the strategic bombing campaign that would ultimately cripple German industry. But Europe was only half the war. In the Pacific, a different challenge demanded a different solution, one even more extreme than the escort missions over Germany. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam fell to American forces in the summer of 1944, providing the 21 Bomber Command with bases within range of Japan. Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, the most advanced bombers ever built, began striking Japanese cities in November. Flying at 30,000 feet with pressurized cabins and remote-controlled gun turrets, the B-29s represented the technological apex of American air power. Yet they suffered devastating losses. Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Force interceptors, primarily Nakajima Ki-84 Franks, Kawasaki Ki-61 Tonys, and Mitsubishi A-6M0s, swarmed the bombers during their vulnerable bombing runs. Without fighter escort, A single B-29 mission could lose 10 to 15 aircraft, each costing over $600,000 and carrying 11 crewmen. The Marianas were 1,500 miles from Tokyo. No existing fighter possessed the range to escort bombers that distance and return. The B-29s flew alone. Military planners identified Iwo Jima as the solution. This volcanic island, barely 8 square miles of sulfurous rock and black sand beaches, sat precisely halfway between the Marianas and Japan. If American forces could capture Iwo Jima and construct fighter bases on its volcanic soil, P-51 Mustangs could fly 760 miles north to escort B-29s over Tokyo, then return the same distance to Iwo. The mathematics were theoretically possible, but practically unprecedented. No fighter had ever operated routinely at such extreme range over open ocean. The mission would require flying for 7 to 8 hours in a cramped cockpit, navigating across featureless water with primitive radio equipment, managing fuel consumption with surgical precision, and maintaining combat effectiveness after spending 4 hours simply reaching the target area. One navigation error, one miscalculated fuel burn rate, one unexpected headwind, and a pilot would exhaust his gasoline somewhere over the Pacific with no hope of rescue. The United States Marine Corps assaulted Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. What planners predicted would be a 3-day operation, stretched into 36 days of the most savage fighting in Pacific history. Japanese forces, commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, had transformed the island into a fortress. 16,000 defenders occupied 11 miles of tunnels, 1,500 underground positions, and countless pillboxes and bunkers, all designed to inflict maximum casualties on the attackers. Marines advancing across black volcanic ash faced interlocking fields of fire from hidden positions. Artillery zeroed on every landing beach pounded assault waves. Mount Suribachi, the island's highest point, bristled with Japanese guns that commanded the entire southern sector. The Marines suffered 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead. Japanese casualties approached 21,000, with only 200 prisoners taken from the entire garrison. Every yard of Iwo Jima cost blood, but even as Marines fought house to house in the island's northern sector, the 7th Fighter Command began arriving. On March 6th, while battle still raged, P-51Ds of the 5th Fighter Group touched down on the partially completed South Field. The 45th, 47th, and 78th Fighter Squadrons unloaded from transport ships and began establishing operations amid the chaos of ongoing combat. Japanese soldiers still held positions less than 2 miles from the runway. Snipers occasionally fired at aircraft and ground crews. Artillery occasionally bracketed the airfield. The volcanic dust that covered everything corroded engines, clogged fuel lines, and abraded flight control surfaces. Humidity from the tropical climate combined with sulfurous fumes from volcanic vents created a corrosive atmosphere that aged aircraft systems at 3 times the normal rate. Maintenance crews worked around the clock replacing spark plugs, cleaning carburetors, and flushing cooling systems contaminated by the omnipresent dust. The 21st Fighter Group arrived March 25th, adding the 46th and 72nd Fighter Squadrons to the island's growing fighter strength. Now 2 groups with 6 squadrons occupied Iwo Jima, their P-51Ds parked in neat rows along taxiways still being constructed by Navy Seabees. The fighters represented the D-Model Mustang, the definitive production variant. Each aircraft measured 32 feet long with a wingspan of 37 feet. The Packard V-16 507 Merlin engine produced 1,490 horsepower, driving a 4-bladed Hamilton standard propeller 11 feet in diameter. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, carried 1,800 rounds total. Maximum speed reached 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Combat radius without drop tanks measured approximately 400 miles. With two 110-gallon drop tanks, ferry range extended to 1,650 miles under ideal conditions. The P-51D weighed 9,400 pounds empty, 12,300 pounds maximum loaded. Its internal fuel capacity totaled 269 gallons spread across 6 fuselage tanks, but specifications meant nothing without operational doctrine. 7 Fighter Command faced the unprecedented challenge of routinely flying fighters beyond their normal combat radius, over open ocean without reliable navigation aids, in unpredictable weather, against an enemy whose capabilities remained uncertain. The command's leadership under Brigadier General Ernest Moore attacked the problem systematically. Navigation would rely on B-29s specially modified as pathfinders. These navigator aircraft would take off ahead of the fighter formations, fly to a predetermined rendezvous point 40 miles north of Iwo Jima near Kita Island, then lead the fighters to Japan. Each P-51 carried an NARA-8 homing adapter connected to its SCR-522 VHF radio. The adapter received directional tones from the B-29's transmitter, displayed as audio signals in the pilot's headset. Flying toward the steady center tone between alternating U and D letters in Morse code kept the fighter on course. Pilots called the system Uncle Dog, using the wartime phonetic alphabet. On the return flight, a B-29 would wait at a rally point off the Japanese coast, transmitting homing signals to guide exhausted fighters back toward Iwo Jima. Air-sea rescue presented equally complex challenges. Statistical analysis predicted that approximately 10% of fighters would fail to return to base due to combat damage, mechanical failure, or fuel exhaustion. Without rescue capability, those pilots faced death by drowning or exposure in the Pacific. 7 Fighter Command established 7 rescue stations along each flight route. The first station, located at the rally point near Japan, consisted of a surfaced submarine covered by a B-29 Super Dumbo and 4 P-51 escorts. 100 miles south, a second submarine waited with another B-29 overhead. At the midway point, a third submarine maintained station. 2 destroyers covered the approaches to Iwo Jima. Finally, amphibious vehicles patrolled the beaches for pilots who ran out of fuel in the final moments before landing. Each station broadcast Uncle Dog homing signals on predetermined frequencies. Pilots in distress could tune their radios to the nearest station and follow the signal to rescue. Fuel management determined survival. The P-51D's 269 gallons of internal fuel plus 220 gallons in drop tanks provided a total of 489 gallons. The Packard Merlin consumed approximately 70 gallons per hour at combat power settings, 50 gallons per hour at cruise, and 30 gallons per hour at maximum economy. A 7-hour mission to Tokyo required 350 gallons minimum, leaving 139 gallons reserve. But this calculation assumed no combat, no navigation errors, no headwinds, and no diversions. Combat power for even 10 minutes consumed 12 gallons. Fighting at full throttle for half an hour exhausted 60 gallons. A 20-mile navigation error added 10 gallons. Facing a 30-knot headwind on the return leg could increase fuel consumption by 15%, turning a marginal fuel state into an emergency. Pilots learned to lean their fuel mixtures aggressively, reduce engine RPM to minimum sustainable settings, and climb to higher altitudes where thinner air reduced drag. They monitored fuel gauges constantly, calculated burn rates mentally, and prepared contingency plans for diverting to rescue stations. The margin between survival and death measured in single gallons. Weather presented the greatest threat. The Pacific between Iwo Jima and Japan represented one of the world's most volatile air masses. Cold high-pressure systems moving southeast from Siberia collided with warm tropical air masses moving north from the equator, generating powerful frontal systems that could span 500 miles. These fronts contained embedded thunderstorms with turbulence capable of tearing aircraft apart, icing conditions that could freeze carburetors and coat wings with debilitating weight, and rain so heavy the visibility dropped to zero. Forecasting tools in 1945 consisted of surface observations, pilot reports, and educated guessing. Weather reconnaissance, B-24s, flew ahead of fighter formations, reporting conditions along the route, but atmospheric conditions could change within hours. Pilots departing Iwo Jima in clear weather might encounter a solid wall of cumulus clouds at 20,000 feet halfway to Japan with no way around and insufficient fuel to return. The choice became penetrating the weather or ditching in the ocean. On March 30th, both fighter groups flew a training mission to Saipan and back. Approximating the distance to Tokyo, the 7.5-hour flight familiarized pilots with the physical demands of very long-range operations. Sitting in the cramped P-51 cockpit for over 7 hours induced muscle cramps, circulation problems, and mental fatigue. The constant engine noise at high frequencies damaged hearing and increased stress levels. Urinating required a relief tube that often malfunctioned, forcing pilots to endure hours of discomfort. The Pacific stretching endlessly below induced a psychological phenomenon pilots called channel fever, the irrational conviction that the aircraft was drifting off course despite instruments showing proper heading. Fighting this sensation while maintaining formation, discipline, and monitoring fuel consumption demanded intense concentration. Many pilots arrived at Saipan physically and mentally exhausted, having not yet faced enemy opposition or combat stress. The training mission revealed critical deficiencies. Radio communication proved unreliable beyond 150 miles. The P-51's VHF radio's effective range. Pilots found themselves out of contact with base and other aircraft for hours at a time, increasing the sense of isolation and vulnerability. Weather cells appeared and dissipated without warning. The Uncle Dog homing system, while theoretically sound, proved temperamental in practice. Some pilots received weak or ambiguous signals. Others lost the signal entirely when the B-29 Navigator aircraft changed altitude or heading. Navigation depended heavily on the B-29 staying precisely on course and maintaining constant altitude, conditions not guaranteed in combat. Fuel consumption varied wildly between aircraft despite identical throttle settings, reflecting manufacturing tolerances in engines and wear patterns in individual aircraft. Some fighters burned 60 gallons per hour at cruise settings, where other aircraft used 45 gallons. This variation meant some pilots would always arrive with less reserve than others, regardless of equal piloting skill. April 7th arrived. The weather forecast predicted marginal conditions with scattered clouds and possible frontal activity near Japan. 21 Bomber Command scheduled 107 B-29s to strike the Nakajima Aircraft Factory in Tokyo's Musashino district, Japan's largest aircraft engine production facility. 7 Fighter Command prepared to launch its first very long-range escort mission. At Southfield, ground crews swarmed over 108 P-51Ds, performing final inspections, topping off fuel tanks, and loading ammunition. Armorers fed belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the wing bays, each aircraft carrying roughly 1,800 rounds, total 300 rounds per gun. Enough for approximately 15 seconds of sustained fire. Ordnance crews checked to drop tanks for leaks and verified proper attachment to underwing pylons. The tanks, fabricated from pressed steel or paper-based composite material, carried 110 gallons each and would be jettisoned after use. Pilots, attended pre-mission briefings at 0400 hours, studying maps, weather charts, and recognition silhouettes of Japanese fighters. Intelligence officers warned that enemy opposition might include Ki-84 Franks, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force's best fighter. The Frank matched the P-51's speed and exceeded its maneuverability, particularly at lower altitudes. Powered by a Nakajima Homar radial engine producing 1900 horsepower, the Ki-84 could reach 427 miles per hour and climb to 30,000 feet in 7 minutes. Armed with two 30mm cannons and two 12.7mm machine guns, it possessed greater firepower than the Mustang. But Japanese pilot quality had deteriorated catastrophically since. 1942. Experienced aces who survived Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea now flew training missions in Japan, preparing kamikaze pilots for suicide attacks. Most interceptor pilots launching against American formations possessed minimal training, perhaps 100 hours flight time compared to the 300 hours American pilots accumulated before entering combat. Japanese industry, crippled by bombing and blockade, produced aircraft with decreasing quality control. Engines failed prematurely. Hydraulic systems leaked. Radios malfunctioned. The Ki-84's sophisticated systems required maintenance standards Japanese. Workshops could no longer maintain DOT at 0615. The first P-51s began rolling down South Field's crushed coral runway. Each fighter accelerated slowly under the weight of full fuel and ammunition loads, plus 2 drop tanks. The pilots lifted off at 140 miles per hour after consuming nearly the entire 6,000-foot runway, then climbed gradually to conserve fuel. They circled north of Iwo Jima at 5,000 feet, forming up into squadron formations of 16 aircraft each. By 0-6-40-5, 6 squadrons orbited in precise echelons, their polished aluminum surfaces gleaming in the morning sun. Japanese pilots monitoring American radio frequencies heard the sudden burst of transmissions as fighters checked in with their leaders, confirming weapon systems and navigation equipment. For 3 years, Japanese interceptors had enjoyed numerical and tactical advantages over Allied aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M0, though obsolete by 1945, had ruled Pacific skies through 1943, but those days had ended. Now American industry outproduced Japanese factories by ratios approaching 20-1. American pilot training programs graduated thousands of competent aviators, while Japanese training collapsed under fuel shortages and instructor casualties. The tactical initiative had reversed completely. Japanese pilots defending their homeland now faced overwhelming American strength at 0700. The formations departed north toward Kita Island, where a specially equipped B-29 waited. The Navigator aircraft's crew had taken off 2 hours earlier, flying a careful course to the rendezvous point. The B-29 orbited at 10,000 feet, transmitting Uncle Dog homing signals continuously. P-51 pilots tuned their radios and followed the audio tones, watching their needle center as they closed on the correct bearing. By 0730, all 6 squadrons had joined with the B-29 and turned northwest toward Japan. The Navigator aircraft's pilots settled into cruise settings, monitoring fuel flow and heading, while the fighters spread into loose escort formation. The Pacific stretched ahead, empty and featureless, the horizon blending sea and sky into indistinct gray. Pilots scanned their instruments repeatedly, confirming heading, altitude, airspeed, fuel quantity. Every few minutes, they switched fuel tanks, equalizing consumption between internal and external supplies. The drop tanks would feed first, preserving internal fuel for the return flight and any combat requiring maximum power. Some pilots ran simple calculations in their heads, multiplying hours by fuel flow rates, subtracting consumed fuel from starting quantities, estimating remaining range. Others simply flew, trusting their training and the bomber ahead. After 2 hours, the formations crossed the halfway point. Japan remained 380 miles ahead, roughly 90 minutes at current speed. Pilots jettisoned their empty drop tanks, watching the steel containers tumble away and splash into the Pacific. The sudden weight reduction gave each fighter a momentary surge of performance before the pilots throttled back to cruise settings. Now the P-51s carried only internal fuel, approximately 190 gallons remaining. The return flight would require 150 gallons minimum, leaving 40 gallons for combat and contingencies. Fuel discipline became critical. Some pilots recalculated their reserves and grew concerned. They were burning slightly more than anticipated, perhaps facing headwinds or running engines slightly rich. The rally point represented their last chance to abort if fuel states became questionable. At 0915, Japanese radar stations detected the incoming formations. Air defense controllers scrambled interceptors from airfields around Tokyo. Pilots of the 47th Dokuritsu Heiko Shutai, flying Ki-84 Franks, lifted off from Narimasu Airfield. Navy fighters, including A-6M0s and J-2M Jacks, departed from coastal bases. In total, between 110 and 125 Japanese fighters climbed to meet the threat. Radar operators vectored interceptors toward the B-29 formations, which had arrived ahead of the fighters and were beginning their bombing runs over the Nakajima plant. Anti-aircraft artillery opened fire, throwing up curtains of flak that burst in black clouds across the sky. The B-29s, flying in tight combat boxes for mutual defensive fire, pressed through the flak toward their initial points. At 0-9-40, the P-51 escorts arrived. Japanese pilots, expecting only bombers, suddenly found themselves facing American fighters 600 miles from any Allied base. The psychological shock proved immense. For months, Japanese interceptor pilots had enjoyed the advantage of attacking bombers without escort, making firing passes then breaking away before the B-29's guns could track them. Now silver P-51s dropped from higher altitude, diving through their formations, machine guns firing. The Americans flew in pairs, wingmen covering leaders, each element supporting adjacent elements in a fluid defensive wheel. When Japanese fighters attempted attacks, Mustangs broke toward them, forcing the attackers to break off or face head-on passes. The Ki-84 pilots, though flying capable aircraft, lacked the tactical sophistication and formation discipline of American pilots. They attacked individually or in loose groups, failing to coordinate strikes that might overwhelm the escort. Lieutenant E.L. Bright, flying with the 47th Fighter Squadron, spotted a Ki-84 attempting a stern attack on a B-29. Bright pushed his throttle forward, accelerating to 420 miles per hour, and closed the distance. At 300 yards, he centered the illuminated gunsight reticle on the Frank's fuselage and squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns roared, firing 800 rounds per minute per gun. Tracers arced across the sky. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punctured the Ki-84's thin aluminum skin and detonated inside the airframe. The Japanese fighter shuddered, trailing smoke, then rolled inverted and spun toward the earth. Bright pulled up, scanning for more targets. He found a Zero attempting to climb away and dove after it, closing to 200 yards before firing again. The Zero's engine exploded in flames. The pilot bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the sky. Bright leveled off, rejoined his wingman, and continued escorting the bombers. Within 15 minutes over the target, he claimed 1 destroyed and 2 probables. Major James Tapp, leading a flight from the 78th Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of 6 Ki-84s, diving toward the B-29s from higher altitude. TAP turned into their attack, forcing the lead Frank to break left. TAP followed, pulling maximum G-forces, his vision graying at the edges as blood drained from his brain. The Frank pilot, sensing the danger, reversed his turn, attempting to shake the pursuer. But the P-51's lighter wing loading and superior power-to-weight ratio gave TAP the advantage. He cut inside the Frank's turn, pulling lead, and fired a 2-second burst at deflection. The .30 caliber rounds walked across the P-84's wing route, severing fuel lines and destroying hydraulic systems. The Japanese fighter rolled violently and began spiraling downward, trailing fuel vapor. TAP watched it fall, confirming the kill, then reversed to engage a second Frank. This pilot proved more skilled, maintaining energy discipline and refusing to turn low and slow where the Mustang dominated. The two fighters engaged in a climbing scissors maneuver, each trying to slide behind the other. TAP eventually gained position and fired at extreme range, scoring hits on the Frank's empennage. The Japanese fighter broke away, trailing smoke, and fled northeast. TAP claimed it as a probable, but did not pursue. Fuel conservation remained paramount. Captain Robert W. Moore experienced the most dramatic encounter, leading a 4-ship flight providing high cover. Moore spotted two P-84s attempting to set up an anvil attack on the bombers. One element diving from above, while another waited below to catch B-29s breaking downward to evade. Moore recognized the tactic and dove to intercept the lower element first, denying them their ambush position. He fired at the lead Frank from nearly 400 yards, using Kentucky windage to compensate for bullet drop at extreme range. Incredibly, the burst struck the Frank's cockpit, killing the pilot instantly. The aircraft rolled onto its back and plunged straight down. Moore immediately pulled up and reversed, climbing back toward the second element, which had now committed to their dive. He met them head-on, firing continuously as the two formations merged at a combined closure rate exceeding 700 miles per hour. One Frank exploded as Moore's rounds ignited its fuel tanks. The other Frank's propeller disintegrated under .50 caliber impacts, forcing the pilot to bail out. Both kills occurred within 45 seconds. An astonishing display of marksmanship and tactical awareness. The bomber formation completed its run at 0-9-50-5 and turned east toward the rally point. Japanese fighters attempted to pursue, but found themselves low on fuel and increasingly vulnerable to the escorting P-51s. Several P-84s crashed while attempting emergency landings at damaged airfields. Others fell to the Mustang's guns during running fights back toward the coast. By 10:15, the formations reached the rally point where a second B-29 Navigator aircraft waited, transmitting Uncle Dog signals. The fighters formed up and began the long return flight to Iwo Jima. Now fuel conservation became critical. Pilots leaned their mixture controls until engines ran rough, then enriched slightly to restore smooth power. They reduced RPM to minimum sustainable levels, accepting lower airspeeds to maximize range. Some pilots climbed to 18,000 feet, where reduced air density decreased drag, though this increased the danger of icing if weather moved in. Others descended to 10,000 feet, where warmer temperatures improved engine efficiency. Each pilot calculated independently, balancing speed against fuel consumption, weighing the risk of running out of gas against the risk of falling behind the formation. Radio discipline collapsed as pilots called out their fuel states, comparing quantities and burn rates. Some fighters carried 100 gallons remaining. Others reported 80 gallons or less. The Navigator B-29 broadcast periodic updates on distance to Iwo Jima and recommended power settings. Two fighters developed engine trouble before reaching the submarine rescue station. One pilot reported rough running and fluctuating oil pressure. He reduced power and began descending toward the submarine while his wingman stayed with him. The submarine crew, monitoring guard frequency, heard the distress call and prepared for rescue operations. The pilot ditched successfully, the P-51 hitting the water in a controlled wheels-up landing. The aircraft sank within seconds. The pilot emerged from the cockpit and inflated his life raft. The submarine surfaced nearby and recovered him within minutes. His wingman circled overhead until confirming rescue, then rejoined the formation. The second troubled fighter lost coolant from a small flak hit that had gone unnoticed during combat. The pilot watched his temperature gauge climb into the red as the Packard Merlin overheated. He advanced his throttle, trading engine life for distance, trying to reach the next rescue station before seizure. The engine lasted another 40 miles before seizing, the propeller freezing in place. The pilot glided down to the ocean, ditched, and was recovered by a destroyer 40 minutes later. Others faced simpler but equally dire problems. Running out of fuel. One pilot from the 78th Fighter Squadron reported 20 gallons remaining with 80 miles to go. He reduced power to absolute minimum, dropped to 5,000 feet to minimize induced drag, and watched his fuel gauge needle bounce on empty. At 20 miles from Iwo Jima, his engine coughed and died. He transmitted a mayday, gave his position, and prepared to ditch. Then he spotted the island ahead, a dark smudge on the horizon. He pushed the stick forward, trading altitude for distance, stretching his glide. At 3 miles offshore, he was down to 500 feet. At 1 mile, he was at 200 feet. He crossed the beach at 50 feet and bellied into the runway, sliding in a shower of sparks before coming to rest. Rescue crews pulled him from the cockpit, shaken but uninjured. His aircraft carried less than 1 gallon of fuel in its tanks. The main formation arrived over Iwo Jima at 14:30, roughly 7 hours and 45 minutes after departure. Pilots entered the landing pattern, configured for landing, and touched down on South Field. Many aircraft taxied to revetments with their fuel gauges reading 0, having burned every drop. Maintenance crews immediately began refueling and rearming, preparing for the next mission. Pilots climbed from their cockpits, exhausted, dehydrated, and disoriented. The post-mission debriefing revealed the stunning results. Of the 108 P-51s that departed, 104 returned to Iwo Jima. The 4 losses included the 2 ditched aircraft whose pilots were rescued. 1 crash-landed on the beach and 1 pilot missing, presumed killed in action over Japan. Against these losses, the fighters had destroyed 21 Japanese aircraft confirmed, 6 probably destroyed, and 15 damaged. The B-29 formation suffered 0 losses to enemy fighters, the first completely protected mission of the war. XE Bomber Command's leadership immediately recognized the significance. With fighter escort, loss rates dropped from 10% to 0. For Japanese defenders, the April 7th mission represented catastrophe. Interceptor units around Tokyo suffered devastating casualties without achieving any bomber kills. The psychological impact exceeded the material losses. For months, Japanese pilots had briefed their missions with the understanding that American bombers flew unescorted, vulnerable to determined attack. Now that fundamental assumption had collapsed. American fighters operated at will over Japan, hundreds of miles from their bases, with enough fuel to engage in sustained combat. Japanese pilots reported the P-51s with incredulous respect. Some called them the Silver Demons. Others used the phrase Silver Death. The polished aluminum finish reflected sunlight, making them difficult to see against cloudy skies. They attacked from above with coordinated tactics, using altitude and speed advantages to dictate engagement parameters. When Japanese fighters attempted to pursue, the Mustangs simply extended away, using superior power and aerodynamic efficiency to open distance. P-84 pilots discovered their aircraft could not catch P-51s in level flight above 20,000 feet. The American fighters possessed both performance superiority and tactical sophistication. The second VLR mission launched April 12th, again targeting the Nakajima factory. This time, 116 P-51s escorted the bombers. Japanese opposition proved less aggressive, with interceptors approaching the formations but breaking away without pressing attacks. The Americans claimed 15 confirmed kills, 6 probable, and 3 damaged. Only 4 P-51s failed to return, all non-combat causes, 2 mechanical failures. 1 ditched from fuel exhaustion, 1 crashed on landing. The pattern continued through subsequent missions. Each time American fighters appeared over Japan, Japanese resistance weakened. Interceptor units hoarded aircraft and trained pilots, anticipating the inevitable invasion of the home islands. They conserved strength rather than waste irreplaceable resources against bomber raids that, however destructive, did not directly threaten Japan's survival. Kamikaze missions consumed aircraft and pilots in deliberate one-way attacks against the invasion fleets off Okinawa, further depleting Japan's defensive strength. By late April, 7 Fighter Command shifted emphasis from bomber escort to independent fighter sweeps targeting Japanese airfields. These missions proved more effective at destroying enemy air power. Rather than waiting for interceptors to attack escorted bombers, American fighters struck aircraft on the ground, catching them parked in revetments or taxiing for takeoff. The first sweep mission launched April 16th with mixed results due to weather, but subsequent missions on April 19th and 22nd achieved devastating success. Low-level strafing runs caught Japanese fighters on the ground at Kanoya Airfield. The initial attacking wave received a green light from the control tower, mistaking the American aircraft for returning Japanese fighters. P-51 swept across the field at 50 feet, guns firing, destroying parked aircraft before defenders could react. Pilots claimed 30 aircraft destroyed on the ground and 70 damaged, plus 32 air-to-air victories. 7 Fighter Command had effectively neutralized Japanese air opposition around Tokyo. The mathematics of attrition worked inexorably against Japan. American industry produced over 14,000 P-51s during the war years at costs approaching $60,000 each. North American Aviation's Inglewood plant alone assembled 26 P-51s per day at peak production, working 3 shifts around the clock. Training programs graduated thousands of qualified pilots per month from bases across the United States. When 7 Fighter Command lost an aircraft, a replacement arrived within days aboard transport ships or escort carriers. When a pilot was killed, another took his place within hours, drawn from the constant stream of graduates completing advanced fighter training in California, Arizona, and Texas. The pipeline never emptied. Behind every pilot in combat stood 10 more waiting for assignment. Behind every aircraft flying from Iwo Jima stood 100 more in depots. On ships or rolling off assembly lines, Japanese industry, crippled by strategic bombing and naval blockade, produced perhaps 3,000 Ki-84s total between March 1944 and August 1945, many of which never reached operational units due to transportation difficulties and fuel shortages. The Nakajima Oda plant, primary manufacturer of the Ki-84, operated at reduced capacity throughout 1945 due to B-29 raids, material shortages, and the dispersal of production facilities into tunnels and underground workshops. Quality control collapsed as inexperienced workers replaced skilled technicians drafted into military service. Engines failed prematurely. Hydraulic systems leaked. Landing gear collapsed during routine operations. The sophisticated Nakajima Homari engine, designed to power the Ki-84 to its impressive Efferfern specifications, required precision manufacturing tolerances Japanese industry could no longer maintain. Cylinder heads warped. Magnetos misfired. Fuel injection systems clogged. Aircraft that might have matched the P-51's performance in 1944 instead became maintenance nightmares that spent more time grounded than flying. Pilot training programs collapsed under fuel shortages that reduced flight instruction to minimal levels. By early 1945, some graduates received less than 40 hours flight time before assignment to combat units, compared to the 300 hours American pilots accumulated before deployment. Japanese instructors, many of them veteran aces with hundreds of combat missions, found themselves teaching students who barely understood basic aerodynamics, much less combat tactics. The fuel allocated for training decreased monthly as reserves dwindled. Students practiced landings without engines running, conserving precious gasoline. They studied dogfighting maneuvers on blackboards rather than practicing them in the air. When they finally reached operational units defending Tokyo, they encountered American pilots who had spent months mastering their aircraft, refining their gunnery, and developing tactical awareness. The disparity in training quality manifested as one-sided combats where Japanese fighters fell in flames while barely scratching their opponents' dot when Japan lost an aircraft or pilot. Replacement became increasingly unlikely. By May 1945, Japanese commanders hoarded approximately 10,000 aircraft of all types throughout the home islands, preparing for the expected invasion. But most of these aircraft lacked fuel. Others lacked trained pilots. Many sat incomplete in damaged factories or hidden in railway tunnels and caves. The reserve fleet existed largely on paper, a statistical illusion that conveyed strength without substance. When American intelligence analysts counted aircraft observed at Japanese airfields, they frequently counted the same aircraft multiple times as Japanese. Ground crews moved them between locations to create the impression of greater numbers. When they counted aircraft in revetments and camouflage positions, they sometimes counted wooden decoys indistinguishable from real aircraft in aerial photographs. The actual operational strength of Japanese air forces defending the home islands probably numbered 3,000 aircraft maximum, of which perhaps 1,000 could fly combat missions on any given day. Against this force, the United States deployed thousands of fighters and bombers operating from Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and the Marianas, supported by carrier task forces that added hundreds more aircraft. The P-51 operations from Iwo Jima continued through the summer as 7 Fighter Command refined its tactics and expanded its operational capacity. The 5th and 21st Fighter Groups were joined by the 506th Fighter Group in June, bringing total strength to 9 squadrons with approximately 150 aircraft operational on any given day. Additional squadrons arrived from the 414th Fighter Group flying P-47 and Thunderbolts, adding heavy fighter-bomber capability to the command's arsenal. By July, 7th Fighter Command could launch 2-group missions daily or massive 4-group strikes involving more than 200 fighters when strategic. Targets demanded maximum effort. Weather remained the greatest threat throughout the campaign, accounting for more mission cancellations than enemy action. The meteorological conditions between Iwo Jima and Japan represented some of the most volatile and unpredictable air masses on Earth. Siberian cold fronts moving southeast collided with tropical warm fronts moving northeast, generating massive weather systems that could span hundreds of miles and extend from sea level to 40,000 feet. These frontal systems embedded multiple thunderstorm cells, each containing turbulence capable of breaking aircraft apart. Icing conditions that added thousands of pounds to airframe weight and disrupted airflow over wings. And precipitation so heavy that pilots could not see their instruments, much less the aircraft flying 3 feet away in formation. On June 1st, 148 P-51s launched on an escort mission to Osaka with expectations of encountering scattered clouds based on the morning forecast. En route, approximately 200 miles north of Iwo Jima, the formations encountered a solid wall of cumulus clouds extending from 10,000 feet to 23,000 feet. The navigator B-29 leading the formation reported the cloud bank and recommended climbing above it, but the tops extended beyond the P-51's efficient cruise altitude. The mission commander faced an immediate decision: abort the mission and return to base, attempt to penetrate the weather, or divert around the cloud system, which would add distance and consume fuel that might be needed later. Weather reconnaissance aircraft ahead reported that the clouds appeared localized and forecast clear conditions beyond. The commander decided to penetrate. The formations entered the clouds in tight trail formation, each element following the aircraft ahead to maintain visual contact. Within minutes, they encountered an unforecasted thunderstorm cell containing severe turbulence that tossed the fighters like toys. Vertical wind shears exceeding 5,000 feet per minute jerked aircraft up and down violently, forcing pilots to fight their controls continuously just to maintain attitude. Horizontal wind shears pushed aircraft sideways, scattering the formation despite pilots' efforts to stay together. Rain hammered windscreens so hard that visibility dropped to zero. Ice formed instantly on leading edges, adding weight and disrupting the careful aerodynamic balance that made the Mustang efficient. Engine intakes iced over, reducing power and causing engines to run rough. Pitot tubes iced, rendering airspeed indicators useless. Attitude indicators tumbled in the violent turbulence, leaving pilots disoriented about whether they were climbing, diving, or turning. In such conditions, collisions became inevitable. Two P-51s, flying barely 20 feet apart to maintain visual contact in the clouds, were slammed together by a wind shear neither pilot could anticipate or counter. The aircraft locked together momentarily before breaking apart, both spinning out off control toward the ocean below. Three more fighters, attempting to climb above the weather, encountered severe icing that added so much weight their engines could not maintain altitude. They stalled, entered spins, and crashed into the Pacific before pilots could recover control. Four aircraft simply disappeared from formation without explanation, whether struck by lightning, torn apart by turbulence, or victims of pilot disorientation that led to loss of control. No one knew. Wreckage was never recovered. 5 pilots became so disoriented in the clouds that they lost all sense of spatial orientation, a phenomenon called vertigo, where the inner ear and visual inputs conflict, leaving pilots unable to determine which direction is up. They fought their instruments, trusting their sensations over the gauges, and flew their aircraft into the ocean while believing they were climbing towards safety. 13 aircraft suffered such severe structural damage from turbulence that they became unflyable. Wings warped, fuselages bent, control surfaces twisted, engines tore partially free from their mounts. Some pilots managed to nurse their crippled aircraft back toward Iwo Jima before ditching near rescue stations. Others faced immediate emergencies and bailed out over open ocean, hoping rescue forces could find them in the storm. By the time the surviving formations broke through the weather system into clear air, 27 aircraft were gone. Radio calls filled the frequency as pilots reported aircraft missing from their formations, called for help, transmitted mayday signals, or simply went silent. The mission commander immediately aborted the strike, ordered all aircraft to return to base, and transmitted emergency requests for all rescue stations to begin search operations. 24 pilots died. Some drowned when their aircraft hit the water at high speed and sank before they could escape the cockpit. Others survived the ditching, but perished from exposure in the cold water before rescue forces arrived. A few died from injuries sustained during violent turbulence or bailouts. 3 pilots were rescued alive, but died from hypothermia despite medical treatment. The disaster represented 7 fighter commands' worst single loss of the war, eliminating nearly 15% of the mission's strength in less than 30 minutes without a single enemy fighter being encountered. The tragedy illustrated the razor-thin margins within which VLR missions operated. Perfect planning, meticulous maintenance, and skilled piloting could all be negated by atmospheric conditions impossible to predict or avoid. Weather reconnaissance aircraft had failed to detect the severity of the thunderstorm embedded in the cloud bank. Forecasters had underestimated the violence of the frontal system, and mission planners had made the reasonable but ultimately fatal decision to penetrate weather that appeared routine on radar and looked manageable from external observation but contained lethal conditions within. The June 1st disaster led to immediate changes in weather procedures. 7 Fighter Command acquired additional weather reconnaissance aircraft and began flying multiple missions at different altitudes to build 3-dimensional pictures of atmospheric conditions along the route. Forecasters received better training in recognizing the signatures of severe weather in the Western Pacific's unique meteorological environment. Mission commanders received explicit authority to abort missions based solely on weather concerns without requiring approval from higher headquarters. Most importantly, the command developed weather minimums. If conditions fell below specified visibility, cloud ceiling, or forecast reliability thresholds, missions would be automatically canceled regardless of strategic importance. The price paid in lives on June 1st bought institutional knowledge that saved countless pilots in subsequent months. But the 24 men who died in that storm never knew. Their sacrifice purchased safety for those who followed Dodd, yet the missions continued. Between April and August, the 7th Fighter Command flew 51 VLR missions, of which 41 proved effective. They destroyed or damaged 1,062 Japanese aircraft, 254 surface vessels, 134 locomotives, 355 railroad cars, 246 buildings, and countless other targets. The cost totaled 157 aircraft lost and 91 pilots killed. But the strategic impact exceeded these numbers. Japanese air forces defending the home islands suffered unsustainable attrition and loss of initiative. 21 bomber commands' loss rates to fighter attack dropped nearly to zero. Perhaps most significantly, Iwo Jima served as emergency landing field for approximately 2,400 B-29s that could not return to the Marianas due to battle damage or fuel exhaustion. Each of those bombers carried 11 crew members. Without Iwo Jima, thousands of airmen would have perished over the Pacific. The VLR missions represented a technical and operational achievement unprecedented in military aviation. No previous Air Force had routinely operated single-seat fighters at such extreme range over open ocean against defended targets. The Royal Air Force's longest escort missions over Europe rarely exceeded 500 miles round trip. Soviet fighters operated within 200 miles of their bases. German fighters defending the Reich never ventured more than 300 miles from their airfields. Only American forces in the Pacific, driven by the tyranny of distance that defined the theater, developed the capability to project fighter power across 760 miles of ocean. The combination of long-range fighter design, effective navigation systems, comprehensive rescue networks, and rigorous fuel management made possible what had seemed impossible in 1944. But technology alone did not determine success. The pilots who flew these missions displayed extraordinary skill, discipline, and courage that transcended mere mechanical operation of machinery. They endured physical discomfort that bordered on torture during 7 to 8 hour missions. The cockpit temperature varied wildly, freezing at high altitude, where thin air provided no insulation and frost formed on instrument panels. then sweltering at low level, where tropical sun heated the greenhouse canopy to oven temperatures. Pilots wore leather jackets and sheepskin boots at altitude, then stripped down to undershirts when descending. Dehydration became chronic as limited water supplies ran out hours before landing. The Mae West life preserver dug into shoulders and restricted breathing. The parachute pack pressed against the spine, causing lower back pain that intensified through the mission. The oxygen mask chafed faces and dried lips until they cracked and bled. After 4 hours airborne, pilots' legs cramped from maintaining constant rudder pressure. Their hands ached from gripping the stick. Their necks hurt from constantly scanning for threats. Their vision blurred from staring at bright sky. Their ears rang from engine noise that, despite the best headsets available, still damaged hearing through prolonged exposure. Psychological stress compounded physical suffering. They fought in the enemy sky, 600 miles from safety, knowing that mechanical failure or combat damage meant death or capture. Every unusual sound from the engine sparked anxiety. Was that cylinder misfiring? Is the oil pressure dropping? Does the coolant temperature seem high? Pilots monitored gauges obsessively, watching for the subtle variations that presaged catastrophic failure. They knew the statistics. Engine failures occurred at predictable rates measured in hours of operation. Each pilot calculated mentally how many hours his particular engine had accumulated, whether it approached the interval where failures clustered, whether maintenance crews might have missed something during pre-flight inspections. The Packard Merlin had proven remarkably reliable, but reliability meant failing once in 1,000 hours, not never. Some pilot somewhere would draw the bad engine. Every pilot wondered whether today was his turn. They navigated across featureless ocean using equipment that worked marginally well under ideal conditions and failed entirely under stress. The Uncle Dog homing system depended on radio signals that faded in and out, especially when flying through weather or at low altitude. Pilots sometimes received conflicting bearings from different stations, forcing them to choose which signal to trust. The magnetic compass precessed slowly, taking minutes to settle after maneuvers, during which time the aircraft might fly miles off course. Dead reckoning calculating position based on heading, airspeed, and elapsed time worked only when pilots knew their exact starting position. True airspeed and wind correction, none of which could be determined with certainty. Navigation errors of 20 to 30 miles were common. Errors of 50 miles occurred frequently enough to keep rescue forces busy. Some pilots simply became lost, their last radio transmissions reporting uncertainty about position before their engines ran out of fuel, and silence followed. They managed fuel consumption with precision that demanded constant mental calculation and discipline that resisted the natural impulse to add throttle and climb. Higher altitude meant greater range, but climbing consumed fuel. Higher speed meant reaching safety faster, but speed burned fuel exponentially. Every decision involved trade-offs between conflicting imperatives. Pilots learned to resist the temptation to reach in their fuel mixture when engines ran rough, accepting decreased performance to preserve range. They learned to ignore airspeed variations and fly by engine RPM and manifold pressure, trusting their calculations over their instincts. They learned to watch other aircraft in formation and match their power settings, distributing fuel consumption equally across the group so no one fell behind due to inefficient engine operation. Those who lacked discipline, who pushed throttles forward when nervous, who climbed unnecessarily or flew faster than required, ran out of fuel and ditched. Those who maintained rigid fuel discipline survived to fly again. They executed combat maneuvers after 4 hours in the cockpit when physical exhaustion and mental fatigue had already degraded their performance to levels that would be considered unsafe in peacetime. Then they fought. They pulled maximum G-forces, their vision tunneling as blood drained from their brains, their muscles straining against the immense forces trying to wrench the aircraft apart. They fired machine guns, managing ammunition conservation while tracking targets, moving at 400 miles per hour through three-dimensional space. They watched for threats from above and behind while attacking targets ahead. They maintained situational awareness of fuel state, ammunition remaining, friendly and enemy aircraft positions, geography, weather, and time. They made split-second decisions with incomplete information and irreversible consequences. Then they navigated home, landing with zero fuel remaining, and did it again the next day. Many were barely 20 years old. They had learned to drive automobiles perhaps 3 years earlier. Now they flew machines worth $60,000, carrying weapons that could destroy cities, operating 600 miles from any support, fighting an enemy that wanted them dead. They carried this responsibility with a casual competence that belied its extraordinary nature. When interviewed decades later, survivors struggled to convey the intensity of those missions to audiences who had never experienced anything comparable. The missions were simultaneously terrifying and routine, deadly and boring, exceptional and ordinary. The veterans remembered specific moments: the morning light on the Pacific, the tracers arcing across the sky, the oil-streaked face of a wingman who barely survived, the empty seat at dinner after someone failed to return. But mostly, they remembered the exhaustion. The P-51 Mustang itself represented the confluence of American industrial capacity and British engineering excellence. The aircraft that North American aviation engineers thought inadequate in 1942 became the finest fighter of the war by 1945. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag and increased range. Its compact Packard Merlin engine provided power and reliability. Its simple construction facilitated maintenance under field conditions. But most importantly, its aerodynamic efficiency enabled the range that made VLR missions feasible. Without the Mustang's fundamental performance characteristics, 7 Fighter Command could not have operated from Iwo Jima. Alternative fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, despite being fitted with additional fuel tanks, lacked sufficient range for Tokyo missions. The P-38 Lightning possessed adequate range, but proved vulnerable to engine failures over water. Only the P-51 combined the necessary attributes of range, performance, and reliability. Japanese pilots who survived the war recalled the P-51 encounters with professional respect and personal dismay. The aircraft represented everything Japan's industry could no longer produce: sophisticated engineering, quality materials, reliable systems, and unlimited quantities. When silver Mustangs appeared over Tokyo, Japanese pilots understood the war's outcome had been determined. Their Ki-84s and Ki-61s matched the P-51 in certain performance parameters, sometimes exceeding it in maneuverability or instantaneous turn rate. But individual aircraft capabilities mattered less than industrial capacity, pilot training, and logistical support. Japan could not replace losses. America could and did. The mathematics of attrition, which Japan's leadership had ignored in 1941 when calculating the prospects of war against the United States, manifested in the skies over Tokyo as an endless stream of silver fighters that appeared, fought, and departed while Japanese interceptors dwindled through irreplaceable losses. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, though controversial in its targeting and execution, achieved its fundamental objective of destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. The B-29 raids, particularly the incendiary attacks against urban areas, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and displaced millions. Whether this level of destruction was militarily necessary or morally justified remains debated. But the presence of P-51 escorts made the bombing campaign feasible. by dramatically reducing bomber losses and enabling sustained operations. Without fighter protection, the B-29 offensive might have been curtailed or abandoned due to unsustainable attrition rates, as had nearly occurred with unescorted daylight bombing over Germany in 1943. The Mustang enabled strategic bombing to continue and intensify through the summer of 1945, maintaining pressure on Japan's leadership and demonstrating American determination to achieve unconditional surrender. In August, the war ended through atomic weapons rather than invasion. The 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8th, convinced Emperor Hirohito to accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms demanding unconditional surrender. The decision came after agonizing deliberations within the Japanese government, where military leaders advocated continuing the fight despite hopeless strategic circumstances. They argued that sacrificing millions of Japanese civilians in a final decisive battle on the home islands might extract concessions from the Allies and preserve the imperial system. But Hirohito, confronted with the reality that atomic weapons made defense impossible and continuation of the war meant national extinction, chose surrender. The invasion never occurred. The 10,000 Japanese aircraft hoarded for homeland defense never flew their intended kamikaze missions against Allied landing fleets. The hundreds of thousands of soldiers occupying fortified positions throughout Japan never fought the climactic battle their commanders had prepared for. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion consisting of Operation Olympic against Kyushu in November 1945 and Operation Coronet against Honshu in March 1946, was cancelled. American planners had estimated casualties ranging from 100,000 to 1 million, depending on the level of Japanese resistance. Japanese military planning documents recovered after the war revealed preparations for total resistance, employing every available weapon and soldier, suggesting Allied casualties might have approached the higher estimates. The atomic bombs, as horrific as they were, likely prevented even greater loss of life that would have resulted from conventional invasion. 7. Fighter commands stood ready for maximum effort operations supporting the invasion when the surrender announcement came. Plans called for establishing additional fighter groups on Okinawa and potentially on Kyushu, once Allied forces secured beachheads there. The command would have flown close air support missions, interdicting Japanese reinforcements and striking military targets throughout the home islands. Pilots had trained for ground attack using rockets, bombs, and napalm in addition to their machine guns. New tactics were being developed for coordinating fires with advancing ground forces, incorporating lessons learned from European operations. All of this planning became moot on August 15th. On August 14th, 150 P-51s flew the final VLR mission, striking airfields around Tokyo in what pilots believed might be the war's last combat operation but could not confirm. The mission encountered minimal opposition. Japanese fighters remained grounded, either conserving strength for the expected invasion or already aware of the imminent surrender. The Mustangs swept across their targets, destroying aircraft and facilities, then returned to Iwo Jima without loss. That night, pilots learned that Emperor Hirohito would broadcast a surrender announcement the following day. The next morning, August 15th, Imperial General Headquarters ordered all military units to cease hostilities. The war that began at Pearl Harbor 3 years, 8 months, and 8 days earlier ended without American forces setting foot on Japanese soil. Though Iwo Jima's capture and the Okinawa campaign had brought American ground forces to within 400 miles of Tokyo, for 7 fighter command pilots, the war's end brought mixed emotions. Relief predominated they had survived when so many had not. But the sudden transition from combat operations to peacetime garrison duty left many feeling unmoored, unsure what came next. Some pilots had been fighting for 3 years and knew nothing except military life. Others had barely begun their combat careers when the war ended. All wondered whether their sacrifices had been necessary, whether the war might have ended differently, whether their dead comrades had died for sufficient cause. These questions, unanswerable at the time, remain debated today. The P-51 Mustang continued serving in various air forces for decades after 1945, demonstrating remarkable longevity for an aircraft designed in 1940. The aircraft fought in Korea, starting in 1950, providing close air support for United Nations ground forces and interdicting North Korean supply lines. Flying from bases in South Korea and Japan, P-51 struck targets throughout North Korea until MiG-15 jet fighters rendered piston-engine fighters obsolete for air-to-air combat. Even then, Mustangs continued serving as ground attack aircraft and forward air controllers until 1953. The Korean War marked the P-51's final major combat deployment by United States forces. Though the aircraft had proven its versatility across 2 major wars and 8 years of combat operations, many Mustangs were exported to Allied nations throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The Republic of China Air Force flew P-51s during the Chinese Civil War and later used them for reconnaissance missions over mainland China and the Taiwan Strait. The Philippine Air Force employed Mustangs against Hukbalahap insurgents. Israel purchased surplus P-51s and flew them during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War and subsequent conflicts through the early 1950s. The Guatemalan Air Force used Mustangs during the following 1954 coup that overthrew President Jacobo Renz. The Dominican Republic flew P-51s as late as 1984, making them among the last Mustangs in military service worldwide. The aircraft's combination of reliability, maintainability, and performance made it attractive to nations with limited budgets and technical sophistication. Some Mustangs remained in limited military service into the 1980s, though by then they served primarily as observation and training aircraft rather than combat platforms. The transition from piston engines to jets, which began in the late 1940s, gradually retired Mustangs from frontline service worldwide. But the aircraft found new life in civilian hands. Surplus P-51s became available at remarkably low prices in the 1950s and 1960s. Some sold for as little as $1,500, less than 3% of their original cost. Racing enthusiasts purchased them for air races, particularly the National Championship air races at Reno, where modified P-51s reached speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Movie studios bought them for aviation films. Private collectors acquired them as flying museums, preserving history in 3 dimensions. Today, surviving P-51s fly as warbirds, prized by collectors and airshow audiences for their aesthetic beauty and historical significance. Approximately 200 P-51s remain airworthy worldwide out of more than 15,000 produced during the war years. Maintaining a P-51 in flying condition costs hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, requiring specialized mechanics, rare parts, and expensive fuel. The Packard Merlin engines, no longer manufactured, must be rebuilt from original components or newly fabricated parts. Propellers, landing gear, instruments, and countless other systems require continuous maintenance and periodic replacement. Despite these challenges, dedicated individuals and organizations keep Mustangs flying, believing that seeing and hearing these aircraft provides connections to history no book or museum display can replicate. They represent an era when engineering innovation and manufacturing excellence combined with human courage to achieve what seemed impossible. The silver fighters that shocked Japanese pilots over Tokyo in 1945 embodied American industrial might at its zenith. When factories worked around the clock, producing 50,000 aircraft per year, when resources flowed without apparent limit from a continental economy mobilized for total war, and when national will focused entirely on achieving unconditional victory regardless of cost. The P-51 emerged from this unique historical moment, shaped by circumstances unlikely to recur. The aircraft's development benefited from the fortunate combination of British aerodynamic requirements, American manufacturing capacity, Rolls-Royce engine technology, and urgent operational necessity that compressed normal development timelines from years to months. Without any single element, the P-51 might never have achieved its ultimate form. The legacy extends beyond the aircraft itself into operational concepts that define post-war air power projection. The VLR missions proved that properly supported fighters could operate at unprecedented ranges, establishing principles that guided Cold War air operations and remain relevant today. The emphasis on air-to-air refueling, sophisticated navigation systems, and comprehensive rescue networks all traced conceptual roots to the Iwo Jima operations. When the United States Air Force developed Strategic Air Command in the late 1940s, planners drew explicitly on lessons learned from VLR missions. They recognized that bombers needed fighter escorts regardless of range, that fighters required navigation aids and rescue coverage to operate safely over vast distances, and that logistical support determined operational capability more than aircraft performance alone. Air-to-air refueling emerged as the solution to range limitations the drop tanks could only partially address. The first experiments with in-flight refueling occurred during the 1920s, but the technology remained impractical until jet engines created fighters that consumed fuel at rates that made internal capacity insufficient for any meaningful range. By the early 1950s, the United States Air Force fielded tanker aircraft specifically designed to extend fighter range indefinitely through multiple refuelings. The concept directly addressed the problem 7 Fighter Command had confronted: how to project fighter power across distances that exceeded organic range. Where P-51 pilots had relied on careful fuel management and good fortune to return to Iwo Jima, modern fighter pilots rely on tankers orbiting along their route, providing fuel on demand. The principle remains identical. Fighters cannot operate effectively at long range without external support. Navigation systems evolved from the primitive Uncle Dog homing equipment to sophisticated inertial navigation, then GPS satellite systems that provide position accuracy within meters anywhere on Earth. But the underlying requirement remains unchanged. Fighters operating over featureless terrain or ocean require reliable means of determining position and course. The technological progression from radio bearings to inertial platforms to satellite signals represents continuous improvement addressing the same fundamental challenge 7 Fighter Command faced in 1945. Modern pilots take for granted that their displays show exact position, ground speed, track, and steering to destination. They forget that these capabilities require decades of development building on experiences of pilots who navigated using audio tones and dead reckoning. Rescue networks expanded from the ad hoc submarine and destroyer stations of 1945 into sophisticated combat search and rescue organizations operating specialized helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and rapid response teams trained specifically for recovering downed aircrew in hostile territory. The modern United States Air Force maintains rescue squadrons equipped with HH-60 Pave Hawk helicopters, HC-130 Combat King tanker transports, and pararescue jumpers who parachute into combat zones to recover pilots. The commitment that no one gets left behind traces directly to the 7 rescue stations, 7 fighter command established along the route to Japan. The resources committed to rescue capability, billions of dollars in aircraft, equipment, training, and personnel reflect institutional recognition that pilots perform better knowing rescue forces will recover them if shot down. The statistical evidence supports this investment. Pilots with confidence in rescue capability fly more aggressively, take necessary risks, and maintain morale even after witnessing losses. Those operating without rescue support become cautious, avoid risks, and suffer declining morale as casualties mount without hope of recovery. Modern air forces take for granted capabilities that seemed miraculous in 1945. Flying halfway around the world, maintaining continuous operations regardless of distance from bases, projecting power across oceans at short notice. United States Air Force fighters routinely deploy from American bases to the Middle East, a distance exceeding 7,000 miles, arriving ready for combat operations within 24 hours. They accomplish this through multiple aerial refuelings, sophisticated logistics planning, and support networks that provide everything from spare parts to maintenance personnel at forward bases. But these capabilities require decades of technological development and operational refinement, all building on foundations laid by the pilots who first flew 760 miles across the Pacific to fight in the enemy's sky and return safely. The VLR missions from Iwo Jima proved that long-range fighter operations were possible. Everything that followed represented improvements on that fundamental proof of concept that the human element remains constant across 8 decades of fighter aviation. Aircraft have evolved from piston-engine Mustangs to supersonic jets capable of Mach 2, from gun-armed interceptors to missile-armed air superiority fighters with beyond visual range capability. But the pilots still face physical stress, psychological pressure, and the constant awareness that mechanical failure or enemy action can kill them instantly. They still train for years to master their aircraft and tactics. They still fly into danger knowing they might not return. The technology has changed everything except the fundamental requirement for skilled, courageous individuals willing to risk their lives in service to their nation. This continuity connects modern fighter pilots to those who flew from Iwo Jima in 1945. Bridging technological revolutions and geopolitical transformations to preserve an unbroken tradition of aerial combat. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.